Thatch will need a lot more than good tactics to survive the hellstorm at Midway. In fact, it's the proper pairing of tactics with the right plane that's among the cornerstones of success in air-to-air combat. We've already seen that the Zero is a better offensive platform than the Wildcat. But in other ways, the American fighter is actually the better plane. I'm meeting with Steve Hinton to tell us how the two warbirds measure up.
All right, Steve, so here we are with the Wildcat, and man, this thing is a tough, squat little plane. I mean, it's almost like a tank with wings.
Well, that's a good way to put it, but you know, Grumman was known for their stout and strong structures, and they call this Grumman Ironworks.
So talk to me a little bit about kind of the skin. I mean, it's tough. It's not like the Zero where it gives when you hit it. I mean, this is a resilient little thing.
Well, like all the American airplanes that were designed, you know, the Wildcat was built in a combat situation as overbuilt. You know, I mean, ensuring the pilot had everything he could, or as much safety as he could, so it's way overbuilt as far as structure.
This extra structure adds weight to the Wildcat, which is one of the main reasons it isn't as maneuverable as the Zero. As for the Zero, one of the more unusual ways you can tell it has a lighter structure than the U.S. fighter is by examining its landing gear.
When I look at the gear assembly on this Zero, I mean, to me, just looking at it, it seems fairly weak.
Well, yeah, it's like a lot of the Japanese airplanes. They're really light. You know, if you look at a Hellcat or look at a Corsair, you're going to see a really strong landing gear, and the fittings in the wings are big and strong, but those are big, heavy airplanes. You know, this airplane landed on a carrier, but it touched down at about 70 miles an hour on approach, and the carrier's doing 20 miles an hour, and it's just a really light airplane, so it didn't need that big, heavy
so I mean, it's a
gear.
little spindly, but if you have a 4,000-pound aircraft flying at 70 knots or 40 knots or whatever it is into the wind on a carrier, it probably didn't need to be too resilient.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, what are these different colors down here? There's blue, yellow, and red.
That's just the ground crew could spot the different colors and know that the dimension of the strut was correct, you know, based on the loading of the aircraft.
So they can just look at it and say, if it's in the blue, it's good. If it's in the yellow, getting close, and it's in the red.
If it's a red, it needs to be serviced.
Time to recharge the struts, huh?
Exactly. Those are the shock struts right here for when you land and take off. They're like, you know, shocks on your car.
And they were like this throughout the life of the Zero. Did they change anything with the gear?
As far as I know, the landing gear seems to be the same on all the Zeros.
Needless to say, the landing gear on the Wildcat is a lot beefier.
Now, Steve, I got to tell you, this is a unique-looking gear assembly for a World War II fighter. You know, most of the ones that I've seen, the gear is up here on the wings, and this one is just right in the fuselage, and you can look all the way through the plane through the gear assembly. So you know what went into this design philosophy?
Of course, you got to remember it's all about strength and structures. If you move the landing gear out here, you've got to build a structure that can carry all the twisting and structural loads is required. Look how long the gear would have to be. Brewster Buffalo had a gear that hinged here, and the retract mechanism was a joke. You know, part of being an effective weapon isn't just making the best airplane, the flying qualities. It's about how to manufacture. How do we mass produce this thing? How do we get 1,000 of these going, not just 12? You know, they'll sacrifice a little here and there, and that's why. And it's a real simple mechanism. You know, in the cockpit, it has the crank. You crank the gear up.
Manually crank the gear up.
Crank the gear up. It's bicycle chains and bell cranks, but it's really strong the way the mechanisms go over center and they lock in position, and it's a really trouble-free design.
Simple, but it got the job done.
Absolutely.
The simple ruggedness of the Wildcat will be an important consideration for Thatch when he's devising his new tactics for the plane. But besides making the Wildcat less maneuverable than the Zero, the extra structure also has some other drawbacks.
So with extra structure comes extra weight. So
exactly.
I would assume that it had a little bit less range, a little bit less of a top speed of some of the other fighters.
Yeah, you know, the Wildcat was really our first successful monoplane, naval fighter. But they built them in large numbers, and the airplane served all through the war. It had a great record, and the guys who flew them loved them.
How about the wings themselves? The fuel is still primarily stored in here?
No, actually, the fuel's all in the fuselage.
Really?
Yeah, the fuel's right below the pilot. Carries 120 gallons of fuel there, and then on these hard points, you could hang 75-gallon external fuel to it, too. So it had a decent range. You know, the efficient speed for this thing is pretty slow, about 130, 140 miles an hour. If you slow it way down, way down, get the engine turning real slow. It had a pretty decent range of about 1,000 miles.
Still not quite up to par with the Zero. I mean, the Zero was a lot lighter.
Exactly.
And carried more fuel.
Yes.
Despite some of the Wildcat's advantages, to me it still looks like the Zero has a big edge in most of the important offensive categories. But one area where the Zero doesn't have an advantage is the pilot Jimmy Thach, and his innovative thinking of aerial tactics and teamwork as the central goal to gain an advantage over the enemy.
The aircraft they were flying, the F4F Wildcat, it offered the pilot great protection, had good firepower, but you had to work together as a team. He understood the limitations of what he was flying, and he understood how to maximize its advantages, and that's what really made him a great pilot.
Thach also possesses those intangible attributes that make someone a great combat leader.
He understood the people around him, the pilots that surrounded him. He understood how to make them better. And when he was in leadership in fighter squadrons before World War II, when the new pilots came into the squadron, he would fly against them. And it would sort of be like trying to really knock off the confidence they may have in themselves after flight school, and maybe the overconfidence as he viewed it, and bring them back down to the level where he could teach them how to be the best fighter pilots that they could be.
By June of 1942, Thach is already a highly regarded squadron commander. But even before he perfects his new tactics against the Zero, the U.S. Navy is already experimenting in the same area.
Mid-1942 was a transition period for the Navy. They were flying fighters at this time, and typically in the divisions of 6 fighters. Earlier, they had formed this division with 2 sections of 3 fighters each, and they were beginning to transition to 3 sections of 2 fighters each.
This is partly because of intelligence from the air war in the European theater, where most air forces are adopting fighter formations based on pairs of fighters, that pair consisting of a leader and a single wingman. But Japanese tactics are very different.
Japanese Zeros at this time typically flew in sections of 3 fighters, or multiples of 3, 6, 9, in a flight. They'd arrange them in a V formation, and each fighter would sometimes weave around in his position so that he could look behind him better and check to make sure nobody was coming up on him from his tail.
The Japanese 3-plane section has a third more offensive firepower than a 2-plane section. But the 2-plane section has several advantages of its own.
A 2-plane formation is much more flexible and in many ways superior to a flight leader and 2 wingmen. In that 3-plane formation, it's very difficult for the 2 wingmen to not only keep formation with the leader and make sure that they don't collide with each other, but also to be looking around for enemy aircraft. They probably spend more time worrying about each other than looking around the airspace. Whereas with a 2-man formation, all that the wingman has to do is worry about covering his formation leader.
Yet even with its somewhat less adaptable formations, the Zero was still the dominant fighter in the opening months of the Pacific Campaign. Based on his assessment of the Japanese fighter, Thach knows that his Wildcats have a big problem.
And he knew that the Zero had better performance in speed, maneuverability, rate of climb, ceiling, all important factors for fighters. So the Zero had significant advantages over his own Wildcat. So he had to develop some kind of teamwork tactics to offset those individual fighter advantages.